She was already halfway out of her chair when the words came, not trembling with fear, but vibrating with that familiar moral heat that has built her brand, clip by clip, share by share. "Do you have any idea," Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez demanded, "what it feels like to be an immigrant right now? Do you have any idea what it's like to wake up and wonder whether your parents or your kids will be pulled from their lives by federal agents? Do you have any idea what that does to a person, Director Kash Patel?" And yes, she was standing, which is not how the rulebook imagines a member's 5 minutes. Members are supposed to stay seated, speak into the mic, and pretend the camera isn't the real audience. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez rose anyway because the moment wasn't really for the witness table. It was for the 30 seconds that gets cut, captioned, and pushed into everyone's feed before lunch. It was for the viral jolt that can turn outrage into donations, the kind that stacks up before midnight while the clip is still hot. The hearing room in Rayburn was wall-to-wall bodies, the press section spilling over, the air thick with anticipation. The hashtag was already moving, because in 2026, the internet doesn't wait for events to happen, it pre-orders them. Her social team watched from 3 floors up like a pit crew, ready to grab the cleanest slice of video the instant the exchange landed. They had fingers hovering over post, because timing is politics now, and speed is sometimes treated like proof. Down at the witness table, Kash Patel sat with a navy suit, no tie, hands folded like a man waiting for a deposition question he's answered 100 times. A thick binder sat to his left, tabs color-coded, but he hadn't cracked it open yet. He wasn't waiting because he'd predicted her exact phrasing. He was waiting because he'd seen her rhythm, the way a litigator learns an opposing counsel's habits. There's always the closing move, the emotional question designed to corner the witness into either conceding and looking weak or refusing and looking cold. Most people flinch at that fork in the road, and that flinch becomes the headline. This time, she picked a question she assumed couldn't be met without political pain. And she assumed wrong. Patel leaned toward the microphone, and his voice didn't rise to meet her energy, which was the first thing that threw the room off balance. He spoke with the calm of someone who has spent years in courtrooms where volume doesn't help you and panic costs you. "Congresswoman," he began, "my parents came here from India. My father arrived with one suitcase and credentials that didn't automatically translate into respect or opportunity. I grew up in Garden City, New York, in a house smaller than this room." He paused, and it wasn't a theatrical pause. It was the kind of pause lawyers use when they want the record to stay clean. "Not for effect," he said, "for accuracy. And before the national security titles and the Washington jobs and the director's chair, I worked as a public defender in Miami-Dade County, Florida. I represented people who had nothing, people who were scared, people who didn't speak English well, people who didn't have papers, people who had nobody. I sat with them in holding cells, argued in front of judges, and made sure they had counsel, because that's what the Constitution demands." Then he looked right at her. "So yes, Congresswoman, I have at least some idea." You could feel the recalculation in the room, not in a cinematic gasp, but in the subtle way a jury shifts when a witness says something the attorneys didn't plan for. AOC's mouth opened and closed because this detail wasn't in her briefing packet. Her staff had prepped her for a partisan caricature, not a former public defender. They'd built their script around the idea that Patel would be defensive, evasive, and easy to frame as a political operator. Nobody had flagged Miami-Dade or the years of standing next to vulnerable defendants while the system rolled over them. Nobody had warned her about the kind of witness who can answer a moral question with lived experience and still keep his tone clinical. And Patel wasn't done, which is the second thing that hit like a punch you don't see coming. He pivoted with the smoothness of someone who knows when to let the opponent finish talking. "Here's what I find striking, Congresswoman," he said, and he reached for the binder like he was reaching for a receipt, not a weapon. "While I was in those courtrooms making sure immigrants had lawyers and understood their rights through the legal process, you were broadcasting a session telling people to resist federal law enforcement, not to find counsel, not to use the courts, not to assert rights the way the system recognizes them, but to resist, to create," he glanced down, "enough friction that they cannot go as fast as they want to go." He let her own phrase hang there because nothing sticks like a person's exact words. Do you know what can happen when someone without legal status physically interferes with an officer executing a lawful warrant? They don't get safer, Patel continued. They can pick up extra charges like obstruction or resisting, charges that make it harder for any lawyer, public defenders like the one I used to be, to keep their case from getting worse. So if your goal was protection, how does advice like that help the people you say you're standing with? How many viewers hear resist and think it means exercise your rights, when legally it can mean something else entirely? Was your webinar a shield, or was it a spark in a place where sparks can burn people who already have the least margin for error? The room went quiet, in that particular way cameras adore and politicians dread. AOC remained standing, microphone live, the red timing light still blinking like a countdown she suddenly couldn't control. For perhaps the first time in her congressional life, she had no immediate line that could turn the exchange back into her story. Not because there is never a response in politics, but because the response she needed required preparation her team didn't do. It required knowing who was sitting at the witness table before she tried to stage manage him. And if you want to understand how that happened, you have to rewind 3 hours to a morning that looked, to her staff, like every other hearing day they'd ever gamed out. It was around 7:30 a.m. when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked into her Longworth office and started running her script. Her chief of staff, Mike Casca, already had coffee ready, a printed rundown, and engagement numbers from the previous night's teasers. "Everything is popping," he told her, "because the machine always loves a fight that's been advertised in advance. The story about you prepping hit millions. The tweet about holding Patel accountable exploded. The progressive outlets are ready for fireworks." "They'll get fireworks," she said, because she understood the assignment as well as anyone on Capitol Hill. She opened a folder that held 5 questions, all built not to gather new facts, because hearings almost never produce new facts, but to manufacture a moment. The plan was clean, and it had worked before. Start with human stakes, force empathy or force a denial. Either way, you get a clip. Then pivot to a constitutional angle with a named anecdote, so it feels tangible, not abstract. Then challenge qualifications on camera because competence attacks travel well. Then finish with the emotional closer, the "do you see them as human" move that turns into a headline and a fundraising email in the same afternoon. Casca reminded her of the rule of modern oversight. We're not here to get answers. We're here to get usable video. AOC nodded, because she didn't invent this era, but she mastered it early. Before her, hearings were mostly C-SPAN background noise. After her, they became content engines. She knew where to look, when to pause, how to land a line, how to aim the question at the audience instead of the witness. Her comms director, Jared Stein, reinforced the enemy portrait they'd built. Patel as a mega-loyalist with no legitimate law enforcement pedigree. Stein framed Patel as a political figure who rode a memo and cable hits into a job he didn't earn. Casca compared it to her old hits, like the Zuckerberg moment, because every team lives off past highlights the way athletes live off past championships. Same playbook, he told her, Zuckerberg with a badge. AOC smiled because she believed she knew how this movie ended. She had the outfit mapped, too. A red blazer that read, "As power on camera," gold earrings from a Bronx shop she could tag later, and a folder labeled "Accountability" in marker big enough for photographers to catch. Maya Torres, her social coordinator, ran the posting schedule like a launch checklist. A pre-hearing tweet queued, clip captions pre-written for 3 outcomes, and a fundraising email drafted with subject line already waiting to be true. Everything was arranged to make the performance feel inevitable. What they didn't know, because they'd done the kind of quick opposition research that lives on headlines, not on court dockets, was that Kash Patel had real courtroom hours. He had tried cases. He had sat across from defendants who couldn't buy their way out of trouble, and he had learned how to stay calm while someone tried to box him in. To their staff, Patel was a symbol, and symbols are easier to defeat than humans. But 3 blocks away at the Hoover Building, Patel was not treating this like content. He was treating it like cross-examination. He sat with his general counsel, Lauren Mitchell, and his deputy, Dan Bongino, with cable news muted in the background like a screensaver. They weren't guessing AOC's exact lines. They were predicting her structure, because structure repeats when it works. "She'll lead with the families," Bongino said, "because that's her closing argument style." "She'll go after your credentials," Patel replied, "because that's the easiest way to cue a crowd reaction." "Then she'll try the emotional knockout," Mitchell added, "because she wants the clip more than the record." Patel opened the binder, and you could almost feel the difference between someone holding props and someone holding preparation. Blue tabs for her public statements, red tabs for ethics material, green for filings, yellow for transcript language. "Here's what she's missing," Patel said, and there was no anger in it, just analysis. "She expects me to react, to get defensive, to look guilty under a camera, because that's what most witnesses do when they're accused in 5-minute bursts. She's used to CEOs who freeze and bureaucrats who hide in jargon. She's not used to a witness who will let her finish, then read her own paperwork back to her without raising his voice." Mitchell agreed the ethics material was strongest because it didn't look partisan on its face, and the transcript language was strong because it used her voice against her. Bongino pointed to the webinar line, "friction," as the kind of phrasing you can't talk your way out of once it's on screen. Patel described the money angle as the closer, because AOC's brand is built on clean, and nothing tests clean like filings and intermediaries. He didn't say she was guilty of anything. He didn't need to. He just needed the audience to wonder whether the brand and the paperwork were living in the same house. And then he said the quiet part of his strategy out loud. "I'm going to answer her questions fully, and my answers will include facts she doesn't want in the frame." Bongino grinned and called it judo, and Patel didn't deny it. "You provide the force," he said. "I provide the direction." By 10 a.m., the hearing room was already full, because people came for a fight even when the agenda promised spreadsheets. AOC entered through the main corridor flanked by allies, cameras popping as she gave a quick line about accountability and immigrant families. Patel came in through a side door with no entourage, no staged quote, just a binder and a calm face. She wanted confrontation. He wanted an audit. And the country always underestimates how entertaining an audit can be when it's done on live television. Chairman Jim Jordan brought the room to order and read the formalities, which nobody listens to except lawyers and C-SPAN diehards. The first stretch was numbers, arrests, seizures, operations, statistics that make sense only if you already care. AOC was counting on the boredom to build appetite for emotion. By the time her slot arrived, the room was ready for the part that felt human, and she intended to deliver it. Jordan recognized the gentlewoman from New York, and AOC sat up, adjusted the mic, and fixed Patel with a prosecutor's stare. She accused the FBI under his leadership of sweeping up immigrant communities, of raids in neighborhoods, of agents showing up at schools, of parents taken in front of children. "Is this what you're proud of?" she asked, because she needed him either to concede pain or to deny it. Patel didn't deny, and he didn't concede in her terms either. He answered with context and numbers, which is the politician's nightmare, because numbers don't cry on camera. He said the Bureau had made thousands of arrests in immigration-related enforcement, and that a substantial portion involved violent histories and gang affiliations, and he tied the operations to public safety. AOC tried to cut him off. "I didn't ask about fentanyl." Patel calmly replied that she asked whether he was proud, and he explained why he was, including the claim that immigrant communities are often the first victims of transnational gangs. Then he drew a line between foreign operatives and immigrants and asked the committee to stop flattening those categories. It was a pivot designed to make her look sloppy. AOC's face tightened because the script was slipping, and you could see her reaching for the next segment like a swimmer reaching for the wall. She brought up the threats against her for holding a Know Your Rights session and framed it as intimidation for reading constitutional protections. Patel said he was glad she raised it, because he had read the entire transcript, not the highlight reel. He asked permission to quote her words, and Jordan nodded, because chairmen love moments that make the other side squirm. Patel read the friction line in a flat voice and explained the difference between advising people of their rights and advising them to physically obstruct enforcement. He emphasized the right to counsel, the right to silence, protections against unreasonable searches, and he said he supported those rights as a former public defender. Then he pointed out the danger. When people interpret resist as physical interference, the consequences can multiply, and those consequences fall hardest on people with the least legal protection. Up in her office, her comms people texted, "Pivot now." And AOC did what talented performers do when the planned joke bombs. She went personal and attacked his qualifications, listing his political ties, suggesting he was unfit to manage a federal law enforcement agency. She delivered it fast, a rapid-fire barrage meant to overwhelm the witness before he could pick a lane. Patel didn't take the bait, didn't chase each point, and waited for her to finish like a man who wants the transcript to show her making the most claims. Then he answered in a steady, chronological rundown of his career, emphasizing courtroom work and national security experience, and contrasted it with her lack of trial experience without insulting her directly. It landed, not because it proved anything on its own, but because it changed the audience's mental image. The room got quiet, in that tense way that means the audience has decided someone said a thing you can't unsay. AOC's expression flashed through surprise, anger, and a brief, reluctant recognition that she had misjudged the matchup. Jordan stayed neutral, but you could see smiles being swallowed behind him because politicians are still human even when they pretend they aren't. AOC looked at the blinking timer and realized she was running out of the only resource that matters in this format: time. So she tried a different attack, the one that puts any administration figure on defense. Accusations of politicized enforcement, lists, targeting, vendettas. Patel's face didn't change, but his eyes sharpened the way a lawyer's do when the opponent opens the door to documents. He said he welcomed accountability, and then he demonstrated what he claimed accountability looked like: by citing public findings about her record. He brought up the House Ethics Committee's findings regarding her attendance at the 2021 Met Gala and described the committee's conclusion that she had impermissibly accepted gifts and reimbursed late. AOC started to respond that the committee did not find intent, and Patel agreed while stressing the optics. The tax the rich message paired with expensive benefits, even if the final determination was administrative, not criminal. Then he moved to campaign finance controversy involving her former chief of staff and associated entities, framing it as a brand contradiction rather than a conviction. He referenced the fact that an FEC matter can end without a definitive resolution when commissioners split, which leaves a cloud of unresolved interpretation rather than a clean exoneration. He also brought up a complaint about use of a member representational allowance and contrasted it with her public denial, emphasizing the difference between campaign funds and office funds. None of it was presented as a settled criminal case. It was presented as paperwork that raised questions about consistency. And that is the most uncomfortable kind of argument because it doesn't require proving corruption, only proving mismatch. AOC's timer blinked like a warning light. She had seconds left, and her brain ran through the emergency playbook she'd used in a dozen hearings to salvage the narrative. When the facts get messy, go moral. When the exchange gets technical, go human. When the witness looks calm, force the witness into a choice that makes calm look cruel. So she softened her voice, reframed the exchange as an attack on her for defending immigrant communities, and asked again the question she believed no one could answer without stepping into a trap. "Do you have any idea what immigrants are feeling?" she asked, and she aimed it at him like a spotlight. "Do you understand the fear of waking up and wondering if your family will be taken away?" In her head, this was the reset button, but Patel had already answered it, and his answer had already rewired the audience's expectations. He repeated his story, parents, upbringing, public defender work, and then returned to the critique that advising resistance could increase legal jeopardy and that the safer counsel is lawyers, rights, and procedures. He said, in effect, that he had tried to protect immigrants through legal representation, and he questioned whether she had protected them by pushing tactics that could backfire. He didn't call her a villain. He didn't declare she knew anything as a fact beyond her words, but he implied what viewers were already thinking. If you speak to millions, you should understand the consequences of how people interpret you. The timer hit 0. The light died, and her 5 minutes ended the way her opponents dream her 5 minutes might end, with no clean closing line. She sat down, and the room moved on, but everyone sensed the real event had already happened. Jordan gave her time-expired statement, and Patel added a brief comment for the record that sounded almost polite, which somehow made it harsher. He noted he had answered her questions and then repeated the questions he said she did not answer, framed as simple inconsistencies. The tax the rich optics, the clean money brand versus messy structures, the immigrant advocacy versus advice that could create legal risk, the denial about taxpayer money versus documented accounts. He closed the binder, and that gesture was the punctuation mark. The hearing kept going with talk of seizures and statistics, but the story was already leaving the room. In politics, the gavel isn't what ends the moment. The producer's walking out is. By the time the next member started asking about interdiction numbers, the press row was already thinning, like a theater audience that has seen the third act twist. You could feel producers doing math in their heads, weighing airtime against diminishing returns. The cameras stayed, because cameras always stay. But the people who decide what America will actually see were already walking. AOC sat still, eyes forward, letting the room move around her the way a swimmer lets water move around a rock. Patel stacked his papers with the neatness of someone who wants the visual to be order, even when the room is chaos. In the hallway outside, staffers from both parties were doing the modern version of field reporting, which is to say they were refreshing their feeds and watching the first edits appear. The first clip to break wasn't her standing question, or her moral framing, or her red blazer under the hearing room lights. It was Patel's quiet line about being a public defender, and the idea that rights aren't slogans, they're procedures, and procedures have consequences. That clip didn't need music, but within minutes someone added music anyway, because the internet can't help itself. It traveled fast, not because it proved a case, but because it flipped the expected roles and made the questioner look like the one being examined. Inside her office, Maya Torres stared at the screen like it had betrayed her. The draft captions they'd prepared for Patel's refusing to answer scenario suddenly looked like props from a play that had been cancelled. If you've ever watched an experienced comms team hit a sudden crisis, you know the first emotion is not panic, it's calculation. What wording keeps your side loyal without making moderates roll their eyes? What framing admits nothing but still feels like confidence? Casca called it what it was in a low voice that nobody would ever repeat on the record. "We got out-prepped," he said, "because in Washington you can survive being out-loved, but being out-prepared on camera is a different kind of bruise." AOC didn't argue, which is how you know she felt it too. She wasn't upset that Patel had attacked her, because politicians know the difference between attack and reply even when they pretend not to. She was upset because he made it difficult to turn her own 5 minutes into a clean, one-directional story. The first instinct in moments like this is to bury the footage under more footage. Flood the zone with your preferred angles, your favorite lines, your cleanest edits. But that only works when you can plausibly claim the other side is distorted or taken out of context. Here, the context was the problem, because the context was a full exchange where he sounded measured and she sounded surprised. And surprise is poison on camera, because it suggests you walked in without fully knowing what you were walking into. So they pivoted to the oldest defense in modern politics, motive. They didn't argue the ethics language line by line, they argued why he would bring it up. They didn't litigate the filing details. They lit up the words political stunt like a flare. "This is retaliation," they told sympathetic reporters. "This is intimidation. This is what happens to voices that threaten power." It's a familiar frame, and familiar frames are comforting the way familiar lies can be comforting. AOC herself stayed quiet for longer than usual, which was the first tell. Normally, her team would have pushed a clip within minutes, a crisp highlight with subtitles, a punchy caption, and a link to donate. But posting too fast when the internet is already running the opposite clip can look like denial. And denial is a weird thing online, because the audience can click, compare, and decide you're performing while the record plays beside you. So she waited, and in Washington, waiting is its own kind of statement. When she finally spoke to reporters, she didn't contest Patel's biography, because biographies are hard to argue with without looking petty. She went broad, describing him as an administration loyalist using a hearing to smear a progressive member of Congress. She framed it as a distraction from families, from fear, from real lives. The language was sharp, but the specifics were thin, which is what happens when specifics aren't your friend. And somewhere in the background, the clip of Patel calmly saying, "I answered your questions, you didn't answer mine," continued to rack up views like a scoreboard nobody wanted to acknowledge. What made this moment stick wasn't any single allegation or any single document. It was the contrast in posture, the difference between performance and record, between moral certainty and administrative detail. Viewers didn't need to know every nuance of House rules or every technical category in federal filings to sense that one person came in to stage a scene and the other came in to manage a transcript. It felt like the difference between a sermon and an audit. And America, for all its addiction to drama, sometimes respects an audit when it's delivered like a closing argument. By early afternoon, the cable panels were set, and the guests were already talking like they'd watched a different hearing. Supportive commentators described AOC as brave and fearless, because bravery is a word that can cover a lot of strategic misfires. Opponents described Patel as surgical, because precision is the compliment people use when they want to say, "You didn't see it coming." Some tried to split the baby, claiming both sides scored points, which is what people say when they're afraid of alienating either audience. But the real audience wasn't watching panels, it was watching clips, and clips don't do nuance, they do impressions. On social media, the battle quickly became a war over what counted as reality. Was this a fearless congresswoman standing up for immigrants, or was it a talented performer meeting a witness who didn't play along? Was Patel's approach accountability, or was it opportunism wearing a tie? Were the documents meaningful, or were they just the kind of paperwork that can be made to look damning if you hold it up to the camera long enough? The honest answer is that paperwork is always meaningful in Washington because paperwork is how Washington hides and how Washington proves. In the Bronx and Queens, the reaction was less ideological and more tired. People who don't live on political Twitter have a different instinct. They ask, does any of this change my rent, my job, my safety, my kids' school? Some saw AOC's standing question and nodded, because fear is real, and they don't need a hearing to tell them that. Others watched the Met Gala segment and felt that old, familiar sting of being talked to by someone who seems to live in a different economic solar system. Not anger, exactly, but the kind of disappointment that makes voters quietly stop volunteering. A neighborhood radio host in the Bronx summed it up in a sentence that was both unfair and revealing. "It's hard to lecture the rich while taking their gifts," he said, "even if you eventually pay them back. That's not a courtroom verdict, it's a gut-level reaction, and politics is mostly gut-level reactions dressed up as policy." For years, AOC's gift has been clarity, the ability to say what she believes without sounding like she borrowed the words from a committee memo. This time, clarity collided with a stack of administrative facts that made the vibe wobble. Democratic leadership responded the way leadership always responds when one of their biggest brands takes a hit. They didn't scold her publicly, because public scolding makes rebels stronger. They didn't fully embrace her either, because full embrace ties your image to her controversy at the worst possible moment. Instead, they did the Washington fade. Fewer mentions, fewer shared stages, fewer photos, less warmth. It's not punishment, they'll say, it's scheduling, which is the polite word for distancing. Republicans, for their part, did what Republicans do when they smell blood. They framed the exchange as proof that progressive politics is theater and nothing else. They didn't need to prove a crime, they just needed to raise doubt about sincerity. Because in American politics, you can survive accusations of incompetence if people believe you mean well, and you can survive accusations of greed if people believe you fight for them. But when the accusation becomes, "You don't practice what you preach," you start losing people who used to forgive everything else. Patel did not go on television that afternoon, which was either discipline or genius, depending on how you want to interpret it. He issued a short written statement that sounded like something a bureaucrat would write, which made it harder to attack as grandstanding. He said he answered the Congresswoman's questions and remained available for further questions, and that he supported constitutional rights for citizens and non-citizens alike. He did not gloat, which is important, because gloating turns a clean win into a moral offense. And he didn't need to gloat, because the internet was doing it for him, for free. The next morning, the fallout entered its second phase, the donor phase. AOC's campaign email went out with a subject line that avoided the hearing specifics and leaned on the broader narrative of being targeted. Her supporters responded, because supporters always respond when their champion is under fire. Patel's allies raised money too, because outrage is bipartisan and fundraising is the only bipartisan skill left in town. Both sides called it a pivotal moment, because every side calls every moment pivotal when there's a link at the bottom of the message. But under the fundraising noise, there was a quieter conversation among Democrats who privately worry about the party's image with working-class voters. They weren't asking whether AOC's politics are correct. They were asking whether her style makes it harder to sell the party as serious. They saw a hearing where she tried to turn data into drama and met someone who made drama look unserious. They saw a witness who spoke like a lawyer and a member who spoke like a producer. And they wondered, not unfairly, whether the country is getting tired of producers. That question matters because 2026 is not 2018. In 2018, a viral moment could make a career because it felt like rebellion against a stale machine. In 2026, viral moments can look like the machine itself, a different kind of machine, but still a machine. People who are exhausted by politics don't necessarily become conservatives. They become allergic. And when voters become allergic, they stop listening long before they stop voting. That suspicion doesn't convict anyone of anything. It doesn't prove corruption. It doesn't prove malice. It doesn't prove hypocrisy in a legal sense. It simply raises a civic question that America keeps relearning the hard way. What happens when messaging outruns governance? What happens when your identity becomes your product, and your product has to ship a new outrage every week to stay relevant? And what happens when someone shows up with a binder and reminds everyone that paperwork, for better or worse, is still how power is measured? In the end, the hearing wasn't about immigrants or ethics rules or federal coordination in the way the official agenda pretended. It was about a collision between two models of modern politics. One model treats attention as the currency and believes the truth is what survives the clip cycle. The other model treats the record as the battlefield and believes the clip is just a byproduct of winning on paper. AOC walked into that room built for the first model, and for one afternoon, Patel made it feel like the second model still mattered.